Hello Stagecraft students. Today we're going to look at the safe use of the miter saw, and we're going to take a look at how to use it, what tasks it's good for, and what the necessary safety precautions are to use when we use it. Before we get started, we're going to need to make sure we have our personal safety equipment like our glasses, our hearing protection, and not required but always suggested, some gloves to keep from getting splinters when we handle the wood. This saw is used for cross-cutting lumber primarily. What that means is if we have a piece of lumber like this, we're going to cut across this way. That's cross-cutting. If we were cutting along the grain, that would be ripping. So the miter saw is limited by the width of its blade as far as what we can cut through. And so it's excellent for cutting lumber, not so good for making longer cuts that we might need to use a table saw for, which we'll look at next. All right, so we're gonna see how this saw works, what it's good for, and a couple of tricks about how to make using it a little bit easier and safer. First of all, we have our blade right here. This limits the size of what we can cut through. Secondly, over here, we have the trigger up in here. If I pull that, it will turn on, and then when I let go, it will stop. Let's try to get a good look at it. Another feature of this saw and why we call it a miter saw is we can adjust the angle that we're cutting. It has several preset angles that are common for carpentry, including a 30 degree and a 45 and a 90 degree cut. So to make this thing move, there's a little lever on the bottom here. We lift that up, and then we can just slide it to where we want it. And then if we want to keep it there for a while, we can take this lever and push it down to lock it in place. This is especially helpful if you're not using one of the preset angles, because it can travel a little bit on you. When we want to move it, we lift that back up, push this little lever, and then find our angle and lock it back into place. Now I'm gonna put on my hearing protection here, and we're going to make a cut. So assuming we've measured and marked this correctly, like we've already practiced in class, you would set this up against the fence right here. You can slide this back and forth to get it close to where you want to cut. You then bring this saw down, keeping your hand away from the trigger. You can make whatever final adjustments you need to make sure the blade is on the line you're trying to cut, and then let the blade come up out of the way. It doesn't have to go all the way up, but we need to make sure that we're not touching the wood. If the blade is touching the wood, it's not going to be going fast enough to actually make the cut, and instead it's just going to grab this piece of wood and try to push it against the fence. It's not going to have anywhere to go, so the saw will kick up and the board might kick out at you. So that's not a good thing. Make sure you check it and then lift the blade up out of the way. You also can make cuts this way, as long as the piece you're cutting is low enough for the safety cover to get out of the way before the blade reaches the wood. Either way is fine. This saw also can lay over on its side to cut an angle this way as opposed to this way. So technically this is a compound miter saw, which means it can create an angle in both directions at once if we need. That's very rare and complicated, and it's unlikely that you'd be having to do that. Most of the time we just adjust the angle down here and then make our cut. All right, so let's get this guy ready. We're gonna make our cut here. Use this old line as our guide, set it up, making sure it's up against the fence all the way, keeping my left hand at a safe distance away from the blade, which is normally beyond the round part of the base here, pushing against the fence, and then I'm going to pull the trigger and a nice easy cut through here. key here is to get the saw up to full speed before it touches the wood. To cut all the way down, push the saw as far as it'll go, and then once you've cut through, you can let go of the trigger and let the blade stop. Allow the saw to return to its upright position, but don't let go of it, stay in control of it. If it's constantly slamming up, it's hard on the spring and the mechanism back there. And then you'll have made a nice straight cut right on your mark. Next, we're going to look at a feature you can use in case you want to make a bunch of the same length cut. Maybe we're going to be cutting a bunch of legs for some platforms and they're all going to be the same length. After I've cut my first board to the length that I want, what I can do is bring the saw down. Back here in the back there's a little knob I can push in to lock it into place. Then I can just press the saw against the blade and then use some kind of object to put against the fence, and then a clamp to clamp it in place. Double check to make sure everything's in the right spot. Then I can release the saw, and now I can just place any piece of wood in here I want. It's going to cut to the length that I've set this block up at, and I could cut 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 of these without having to measure again. Although it would be smart to, every 10 or so, check your measurement to make sure that the block hasn't moved, because it can sometimes, especially if this isn't very tight. The other thing you want to watch out at the beginning, and if you're making repeated cuts, is that you clear any debris off of the fence so that your piece of wood is always resting neatly against the fence. If there's some debris in there, you can get an angle. If the debris builds up here on this end where you're cutting, or where your block is, you can not be able to get the wood to the block, and it will be cutting the object too short. Okay, so that's one very common thing we'll do here when we're cutting legs, especially for a platform. All right, that is the miter saw. We use it all the time, pretty common tool, easy to use. We don't need to force this thing down super fast. You don't have to go too slow, just a nice easy push through, and make sure everything is set up for the angle you want. And this tool will make the cut exactly where you need, nice and accurately and pretty easily.